After graduating from college, I was desperate for a job, any job. So when I got a position as a delivery driver for a small company, I jumped at the opportunity. It wasn't glamorous, but it was work. I never imagined that my first night on the job would turn into a nightmare. It was a cold, windy evening when I started my shift. The delivery route was long, taking me through winding country roads and remote rural areas. I loaded the van with packages, each with a specific address, and set off into the night. The first few deliveries were uneventful. The houses were dark, and the streets were empty, but I figured it was just because it was so late. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the isolation started to get to me. There were no streetlights, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Around midnight, I reached a particularly remote part of the route. The GPS directed me to a small, narrow road that seemed to lead nowhere. I hesitated, but I had a job to do, so I turned down the road and continued driving. After a few miles, I arrived at an old, decrepit house. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds. The package was addressed to this house, so I parked the van and grabbed the box. As I approached the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. I decided to leave the package on the porch and head back to the van. As I turned to leave, the door creaked open. A middle-aged woman stood in the doorway, her face gaunt and pale. She wore a tattered dress, and her eyes had a haunted look. "Delivery," I said, holding out the package. She stared at me for a moment before taking the box. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Come inside, please. I have something for you." Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to be rude. Reluctantly, I followed her into the house. The interior was even more dilapidated than the exterior, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The air was thick with the smell of decay. "Please sit," she said, motioning to a dusty, threadbare couch. I sat down, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. She disappeared into another room, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. As I waited, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls and floorboards. They looked like some kind of runes or sigils. After a few minutes, she returned with a small, ornate box. "This is for you," she said, handing it to me. "It's a token of appreciation." I took the box, my hands trembling. "Thank you," I said, eager to leave. As I stood up to go, she grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Beware the shadows," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I pulled away, my heart racing, and hurried back to the van. I drove away as fast as I could, the woman's warning echoing in my mind. The road seemed even darker and more desolate than before, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I stopped at the next house on my route, a small cottage surrounded by trees. I delivered the package and got back into the van, but as I started the engine, I noticed something strange. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to move, almost as if they were alive. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself. "You're letting that woman get to you." But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. As I drove to the next delivery, I saw fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes. Shadows that seemed to follow me, darting between trees and buildings. I arrived at the last house on my route, a large old farmhouse. The lights were on, and I could hear music coming from inside. I knocked on the door, and a man in his 40s answered, looking slightly annoyed. "Package for you," I said, handing him the box. He took it and muttered a thanks before closing the door. As I walked back to the van, I noticed something odd. The shadows on the ground seemed to shift and change shape, forming eerie humanoid figures. Panic set in, and I hurriedly got into the van and drove away. The drive back to the warehouse felt like an eternity. The shadows seemed to follow me, growing bolder and more defined with each passing mile. When I finally reached the warehouse, I parked the van and ran inside, my heart pounding. The other drivers were still out on their routes, and the place was eerily quiet. I went to the manager's office and handed in my delivery logs. "How was your first night?" he asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Strange," I replied, struggling to find the right words. I think someone was following me." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Did you see anyone?" "No, but the shadows. They seemed to move," he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're not the first driver to say that. There have been stories about that route for years. People say it's cursed." "Cursed?" I echoed, feeling a chill run down my spine. He nodded. "Strange things happen out there. Shadows that move, voices that whisper. Most of the drivers refuse to take that route." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, anger and fear mixing in my voice. "Because we needed someone to cover it," he said bluntly. "If you don't want to go back, I understand, but we need drivers who can handle the job." I left the office, my mind racing. The thought of going back out there terrified me, but I needed the job. I decided to give it one more chance, hoping that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next night, I loaded up the van and set off on the same route. The shadows seemed to be waiting for me, moving in the periphery of my vision. I tried to focus on the deliveries, but the fear was overwhelming. As I approached the old mansion, I saw the woman standing in the driveway. She waved at me, a look of desperation on her face. Against my better judgment, I stopped the van and got out. "They're here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The shadows are here." I looked around, my heart pounding. The shadows seemed to gather, growing darker and more solid. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the whispering began again. "Leave this place," she said, her voice trembling. "Leave and never come back." I nodded, too scared to argue. I got back into the van and drove away, the shadows following me. I knew then that I couldn't do this job anymore. The fear was too much, the danger too real. The next day, I handed in my resignation. The manager didn't seem surprised. "You did the right thing," he said. "Some things are more important than a job." I left the warehouse feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. I never went back to that part of town again. I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities before. The current hospital I work at is a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you'll soon understand why. This was on my second to last shift at this hospital, unbeknownst to me at the start of that night. I was working the graveyard shifts and was running on negative hours of sleep. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s among the residents of this ward, who were otherwise left to themselves to float around in their minds, I'm sure, saw me as a breath of fresh air, someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday. If you're just left to yourself, you can mentally go to other places, but with someone else in your space, you're tied to that moment in time. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. This was my first night dealing with her, and she kept telling me anytime I entered her room about the voices she kept hearing and the man dressed in black she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in her room requested her curtain be closed before my shift started so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady who smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 9 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by 11, but not Lena. Whenever she called me into the room, she'd be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing and the man in black that kept staring at her in the corner of the room. Not gonna lie, it was creeping me out a little. I believed that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagined them to be very scary. But still, I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room. I held Lena's hands and told her it's okay to breathe and to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't here alone and I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Lena relaxed for a while, and the next time I came into the room, she was asleep. Once most, if not all, of the patients were asleep, the night goes much slower. Time almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed too, which is why hearing another noise was weird. I turned, saw nothing, and resumed stocking my cart. Then I felt what I can only describe as a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, jumped, and screamed. But there was nothing on my shoulder. There was no one in the room, yet I knew I felt something large basically grab my shoulder. I went out into the hall for a second to peek my head, but no other nurses were in sight. It was dead quiet. I had nothing else to do but resume what I was doing. I continued stocking the cart until it was full. Then I turned to face the door, and I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart immediately shot to my throat. There was a man dressed in black standing outside the door, looking through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door. Seconds later, the door opened, and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor, as I was hysterical. I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There's no one else here. We checked all the rooms in the ward. There wasn't anybody dressed in black in there." My screams woke Lena from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room, she started talking of the voices again. This time, she mentioned the screams, which she didn't know were mine. I asked her what the man in black looked like and if he was smiling. She looked at me, and I noticed her eyebrows point down as her expression changed to the most focused I'd seen her the entire day. She asked, "How did you know?" Even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat as she said this. She started screaming now, yelling, "Get me out of here. He's coming." The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last, that the experience traumatized me, and that I didn't really want to be in that building anymore. I got as friendly a response as I could have hoped for. I've never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I'm aware of the effects of lack of sleep, but this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Lena was telling me all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man behind the glass door matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime, unexplainable supernatural occurrences. At least, I hope it was once in a lifetime. grew up in a town located in a fairly rural section of our country. During the time I was growing up, there were only a few pockets of woodland left due to fast urbanization, and those too were bordered by housing complexes. I despised walking through those trees because they always gave me a weird feeling. However, the shortest path from our street to pretty much anywhere was to take a trail that led from the end of the street, around the back of the houses, and through the woods. When I used to cross this trail, my heart would race the entire time. But I always had to go through the woods when my mother sent me to the store to pick something up or when I had to walk to school. My older brother constantly told me that the woods were haunted by spirits because he knew how frightened I was of them. In the winter, when it was nearly dark when we got home from school, larger kids would lurk behind the trees to frighten the younger ones and demand any money or, occasionally, even their cell phones. Being a smaller female, this was even more terrifying. Since I'm an adult now, I was no longer afraid of the woods. When I went back to my hometown last year, a few days in, it began snowing pretty heavily. My mom, being the kind woman that she is, called our elderly neighbor and informed her that she could walk her dog so that she wouldn't have to take the risk of tripping on the slippery pavement. This was a regular good deed that my mom would do for the neighbor. Of course, I told my mom I could do it for her, as I knew she didn't like the cold, and I wanted to do something nice for her while I was there. I was strolling with a Labrador dog along the same path that went through the woods. Since it doesn't snow very often where I currently reside, I took my recently purchased DSLR camera with me to capture the view. Toward the beginning of the path, I stopped to take a quick picture. As I tried to frame the camera, a scream in the distance made me jump. It sounded like kids playing around, though, so I continued about my business. Although I was thoroughly enjoying the stroll, I started to grow a little chilly, and I didn't want to overwork the neighbor's dog, so I was going to turn around. Then, I heard something scurrying toward us. We were briefly out of sight, partially in the woods, and it sounded like someone was hurrying along the main path. I'm not sure why the idea to hide came to me, but it was a gut instinct, so that's exactly what I did. I paused briefly before stepping completely off the path and hiding amid the shrubs and trees. I suppose I was also concerned that if a thief noticed my camera, he could think I was an easy target. The dog hesitated when I tugged on its leash, but then it quickly followed me into the bushes, just in time as a person approached on the path only a few feet away. I knelt down and put my hand on the Labrador's head. I didn't get a close look at him, but I could make out that he was a tall man wearing a black beanie and a brown jacket. He was moving hastily, looking all around frantically, with both of his hands clenched into fists. Thank goodness the dog stayed calm. Once the man left, the dog and I re-entered the trail. After he had vanished from view, I decided to capture a few more photos before we went back home. On our way back, a noisy helicopter disrupted the total silence. It wasn't until we were out of the trees and behind the houses that I could clearly see it. I noticed a police aircraft circling some nearby trees. Without incident, I brought the dog back to my mother's elderly neighbor. I didn't give the walk any more thought until the next morning, when my mother turned on the local morning news station. Their top-breaking news story was that the police were looking for a man who had stabbed 2 women on a deserted pathway the previous night, one of whom had survived. The route they had outlined connected with the forest I had been strolling in. The suspect was described as being tall and sporting a black cap along with a dark jacket. That's when I realized I had seen a murderer running away from his crime scene, and it was only my gut instinct, along with my concern about my camera, that had prevented me from almost being stabbed in the midst of the forest. For the past couple of years, I've had the same job. I'm a janitor for a popular fast food restaurant. I don't take orders or anything aside from cleaning. I don't even see other workers a lot of the time because I'm scheduled overnight. At the restaurant, everything needs to be deep cleaned every day, and during open hours, it's basically impossible to do. I'd never had anything happen during my shifts, aside from the occasional customer knocking on the window asking if we were open. So on this night, I came in and got to work like I usually did. A couple of other employees were still there when I arrived, but by 10 p.m., which was an hour after closing, it was just me for the rest of the night. I popped in my headphones and started scraping the grills and prepping everything that needed to be hosed down. After a while, I lost track of time, but my best guess is that it was around 12 a.m. when I heard a knock at the front of the building. I pulled off my headphones, hearing it again. I walked to the front, expecting someone at the door wanting to see if we were closed. But when I looked, nobody was there. I went up to the door and looked out at the parking lot. No cars or people. I knew I'd heard it from this side of the building, though, so I waited for it again, but there was nothing. I ended up thinking I just mistook another sound for knocking and went back to work. Another hour or so went by, then I took a lunch break. I grabbed my lunch bag and sat at one of the tables in the middle of the dining area, taking my time since I was actually ahead on my cleaning. Once I finished eating, I went to the back and turned to grab the mop, only to see a man's face staring at me from outside the drive-through window. He had messy hair and a blank expression, but his eyes had something strange about them, like they were empty. I froze for a second, and after a moment, the man calmly turned and walked away. My heart was racing in my chest, and I just stood in place, listening to his departing footsteps. I didn't know what to think. It was just incredibly creepy and strange. Once I got my confidence back, I opened the window and looked out to make sure he had left. It was dark beyond the light of the restaurant, but I didn't see anyone, so I closed it up and locked it. I was on edge for the next hour, constantly looking behind me at the windows, feeling like I was being watched. But as my shift was coming to an end, I started to feel some relief, and the anxiety calmed down. One of the last few things I had to do was roll all the garbage bags out to the dumpster, which I was avoiding for as long as I could. I checked the window before I stepped out, and it looked clear, so I quickly opened the door and got the garbage out. I started tossing the bags one by one into the dumpster, but not even 20 seconds in, the man appeared from around the corner. I stopped what I was doing and quickly asked what he needed. He didn't respond as he walked up to me, and he had that same empty stare. Now that I could see his whole body, though, he was even more terrifying, being a fairly large man and wearing a dirty and stained coat. Not knowing what else to do, I ran for the door. I opened it as the man's footsteps rushed up behind me, and as I slammed the door shut, the man was able to stick his arm into the gap, preventing it from closing. I turned and sprinted to the other end of the restaurant, getting my keys out and unlocking the front door as fast as I could, all while hearing the man closing the distance on me. I barely got away again and ran before he got to me. I sprinted across the parking lot and as far as I could while calling the police. 5 minutes later, the police arrived at the restaurant, but the man was gone. We got footage from the CCTV cameras, but no identity could be made of it. The footage also showed that as soon as I ran away, the man just stood there and watched me for a bit, then left out the back door. What he wanted from me is unknown, but his creepy and objectively horrifying behavior gives me chills even to this day. Here's the revised version of your text with proper paragraphing and punctuation. I've handled more than my fair share of break-ins and home invasions over the years. Most of the time it's straightforward. An open window, a forced door, a stolen TV. But every now and then you get a call that sticks with you. one that makes you question everything you think you know about safety and security. This story is about one of those calls. It started as a routine check, but it quickly spiraled into something much more terrifying. A night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a warm summer night, one of those evenings where the air is thick and heavy, and the sun takes its time setting. I was just about to wrap up my shift when the call came in. A woman in her mid-30s had reported hearing strange noises in her house. She was alone, scared, and convinced that someone had broken in. My first thought was that it was just another case of paranoia. People get jumpy when they're by themselves at night. But something in her voice made me pause. There was a tremor, a note of genuine fear that I couldn't ignore. I responded to the call and made my way to her address. A small, tidy house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where nothing ever happens, where the biggest excitement is the annual block party. The street was lined with neat lawns and white picket fences, each house almost identical to the next. But as I pulled up in front of her house, I noticed that it was the only one with the lights still on. Every window was ablaze with light, as if she was trying to keep the darkness at bay. I parked the car and approached the front door, my hand resting on my holster. I knocked, calling out her name, and after a moment, the door creaked open. The woman stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was dressed in a bathrobe, her hair tousled as if she'd been woken up suddenly. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I keep hearing these noises. I swear someone's in my house." I gave her a reassuring smile, even though my gut told me something was off. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'm here to help. Let's check it out together." She led me inside, and I immediately noticed how spotless everything was. The house was immaculate. No sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing out of place. But the air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. She guided me through the living room and into the hallway, her hands wringing the edge of her bathrobe. "I was in bed trying to sleep," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. But then I heard it, this scratching noise, like something moving around. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the house settling, but then it got louder. It sounded like it was coming from under the bed. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her whole body seemed to tremble as she spoke. "Have you checked under the bed?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head quickly. "No, I was too scared. I locked myself in the bathroom and called you." I nodded, trying to keep my own nerves in check. "Okay, let's go take a look. I'm sure it's nothing, but it's better to be safe." We headed down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under our feet. We reached her bedroom, and she hesitated at the door, her hand gripping the doorknob so tightly her knuckles were white. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she seemed to brace herself for whatever might be inside. I took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open. The room was exactly what you'd expect. A neatly made bed, a nightstand with a lamp, a dresser against the wall. But there was something off about it, something that set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to gather in the corners, or the way the air felt heavy and oppressive. Whatever it was, it made my skin crawl. I stepped into the room, the floor creaking under my weight, and slowly made my way to the bed. The woman hovered in the doorway, watching me with wide, anxious eyes. "Stay there," I told her softly, and she nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the door frame. I knelt down beside the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the cool draft from the open window behind me, the curtains rustling softly in the breeze. I reached out and lifted the bedspread, shining my flashlight into the darkness underneath. At first, I didn't see anything, just dust bunnies and old shoes, the usual forgotten things that accumulate under a bed. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like something shifting in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I inched the flashlight closer, trying to see what had made the noise. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes, wide and staring, reflecting the light back at me. My heart stopped for a moment. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at those eyes, unblinking and unfeeling, watching me from the darkness. I pulled back instinctively, my mind racing. What the hell was under there? My hand went to my holster, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle of my gun. I had to stay calm, had to think this through, but the fear was overwhelming, clawing at my throat and making it hard to breathe. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to step back slowly. Someone is under the bed." Her eyes widened in terror, but she didn't move, frozen in place by fear. I didn't blame her. I felt the same cold dread creeping up my spine, the same paralyzing terror. But I had to stay focused. I had to protect her. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the bed, my hands still on my gun. "Whoever you are, come out slowly," I ordered, my voice firmer now, more authoritative. But there was no response, just that same eerie silence, broken only by the faint rustling beneath the bed. I took a step back, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just leave her there. I couldn't just walk away. But I also couldn't ignore the very real possibility that there was a dangerous intruder hiding just feet away from us. I glanced at the woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Go to the living room," I whispered. Now she nodded quickly, her feet finally moving as she backed out of the room, her hands still clutching the door frame. I watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading as she hurried down the hallway. Now it was just me and the intruder. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears it almost drowned out everything else. I couldn't just wait. I couldn't just stand there doing nothing. I had to act. I knelt back down, gripping the edge of the bed frame, and yanked the bed away from the wall, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. And there he was, a man thin and wiry, with wild eyes and matted hair, curled up in the fetal position under the bed. His clothes were filthy and torn, his skin covered in grime. But it was his eyes that struck me the most, wide, unblinking, staring up at me with a mixture of fear and madness. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just kept staring at me with those wild, crazed eyes. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out at any moment. "Come out slowly," I ordered again, my voice as calm as I could manage. But he didn't move, didn't react. It was as if he was in a trance, completely disconnected from reality. I had to get him out of there. I had to end this without anyone getting hurt. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't just drag him out. He might lash out, might have a weapon. I needed to de-escalate, to keep things under control. "Hey," I said softly, lowering my gun slightly. "It's okay. You're not in trouble. Just come out and we can talk. All right?" For a moment, I thought it might work. His eyes flickered, his gaze shifting slightly as if he was trying to comprehend what I was saying. But then, in an instant, his expression changed. His face twisted into a snarl, and he lunged at me, his hands clawing at the air. I barely had time to react, stumbling back as he scrambled out from under the bed. His movements were frantic and wild. He charged at me, his arms flailing, his mouth open in a silent scream. I fired a shot into the floor, the loud crack echoing through the room. and he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with shock. For a split second, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. Then, without warning, he bolted, running past me and out of the room. I heard his footsteps pounding down the hallway, the front door slamming open as he ran into the night. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart still racing. It was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just a simple break-in. The woman was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a pillow to her chest. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, her face pale and drawn. "Is he gone?" she whispered. I nodded, trying to offer her a reassuring smile. "He's gone. You're safe now." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't true, that there was something more to this. The way he looked at me, the way he'd hidden under the bed. It wasn't just fear or desperation. There was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath, trying to push the thoughts away. I'd done my job. I'd kept her safe. That was all that mattered. But as I left her house, the night air cool against my skin, I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, the way they'd stared up at me from the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just hiding from us. He was hiding from something else, something far worse. In the days that followed, I tried to put it behind me to move on. But the memory of that night, of those eyes, lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that wouldn't go away. I spoke to other officers, asked if they'd ever experienced anything like it. Most of them shrugged it off, chalking it up to stress, to the unpredictable nature of the job. But a few of them, the ones who'd been on the force for years, gave me knowing looks, their expressions serious. "There are things out there," one of them said, his voice low and somber. "Sometimes we get a glimpse of them, just for a moment. And when we do, it's best not to ask too many questions." I didn't press the matter, didn't push for answers, but the words stayed with me, echoing in my mind every time I thought about that night, about the man under the bed. And every time I go to bed, every time I hear a noise in the dark, I can't help but check under the bed just to make sure. I got the job as a community center coordinator in a rural area. I was thrilled. It was my first real job after college, and I was eager to make a good impression. The community center was a hub for the small town, hosting various events and activities. However, my excitement quickly turned to fear during my first evening on the job. The community center was an old two-story building surrounded by fields and woods. It had a quaint, welcoming exterior, but inside, the dim lighting and creaky floors gave it a slightly eerie atmosphere. I arrived in the late afternoon, greeted by the manager, Mr. Carson, a friendly man in his 50s with a warm smile. "Welcome to the team," he said, shaking my hand. "We're glad to have you here. Tonight, we're hosting a welcome ceremony for you. It's a tradition here." I was touched by the gesture and looked forward to meeting the community members. I spent the next few hours getting acquainted with the facility and my responsibilities, feeling more comfortable as time went on. As evening approached, the center started filling up with people. Mr. Carson introduced me to several of the staff and community members, all of whom were friendly and welcoming. The ceremony was set to take place in the large hall on the second floor. The hall was beautifully decorated with candles and flowers, giving it a festive yet intimate feel. As I mingled with the guests, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. There was something about the way everyone was looking at me, too intense, too eager. Mr. Carson called everyone to attention and began the ceremony. He spoke warmly about the community and the importance of the center, then introduced me as the new coordinator. I stepped up to the podium, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. "Thank you all for this warm welcome," I began, smiling at the audience. "I'm excited to be here and to get to know all of you." As I spoke, I noticed something odd in the back of the hall. A group of people stood together, their expressions blank and their eyes fixed on me. They were all dressed in simple dark clothing, standing perfectly still. After my speech, Mr. Carson invited me to join a smaller group for a more private welcome in one of the downstairs rooms. I followed him and a few others, including the group from the back of the hall, down the dimly lit stairs to a small room off the main hallway. The room was sparse, with a single table and a few chairs. The group formed a circle around me, and Mr. Carson lit a few candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This is a special tradition," he explained in a low voice, "a way for us to truly welcome you into our community." I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere had shifted from festive to something darker. The group began chanting softly, their voices blending into a haunting melody. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do, as the chanting grew louder. One of the group members, a woman with long dark hair, stepped forward. She held a small bowl filled with a thick red liquid. "Drink this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It will bind you to us." My heart was pounding in my chest. "I don't think I can do this," I said, backing away. Mr. Carson's smile faded, replaced by a look of disappointment. "It's just a part of the ceremony," he insisted. "You need to drink it." I shook my head, panic rising within me. "No, I can't." The group moved closer, their chanting growing louder and more insistent. I felt trapped, the walls closing in around me. Suddenly, the door burst open, and another staff member, a young man named Kevin, rushed in. "Stop!" he shouted, pushing through the crowd to reach me. "Leave her alone." The chanting stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. Mr. Carson glared at Kevin, his eyes filled with anger. "What are you doing here?" Kevin grabbed my hand and pulled me towards the door. "She's not ready for this," he said, his voice trembling. "Let her go." We rushed out of the room and down the hallway, the sound of footsteps behind us. We burst through the front door and into the cool night air, my heart racing with fear. Kevin led me to his car, and we sped away from the community center. As we drove, he explained that he had been suspicious of the group for a while. They were more than just a close-knit community. They were a cult. "They've been trying to recruit new members for years," he said, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "But it's always been under the guise of community activities. When I saw what they were doing to you, I knew I had to step in." My mind reeled with the revelation. What would have happened if I had drunk that, whatever it was? Kevin shook his head. "I don't know, but it wouldn't have been good. They have a way of controlling people, making them do things they wouldn't normally do." We drove to the nearest town, where Kevin dropped me off at a small diner. He insisted I stay there while he went to get help. I watched as he drove away, my thoughts racing. I sat in the diner, sipping a cup of coffee and trying to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with messages from Mr. Carson, but I ignored them, too shaken to respond. Kevin returned with a local police officer, and I recounted the entire experience. The officer listened carefully, taking notes and assuring me that they would investigate the community center. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, his expression sympathetic. "We've had our suspicions about that place, but we've never had enough evidence to act. Your account will help us build a case." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. The officer gave me his card and offered to escort me back to my apartment. which I gratefully accepted. As I settled back into my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The experience had left a deep scar, and I knew it would take time to heal. I quit the job at the community center, unable to face returning to that place. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my town. I had just started my first job in the field, so of course, I had to work the shift that nobody else wanted. Overnight. Working overnight wasn't as terrible as I thought, though. It was actually pretty peaceful. My job mainly consisted of looking through log files to make sure nothing sketchy happened while the rest of the crew was sleeping. This meant I was pretty much alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep pretty often, as staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was hard on my eyes. With nobody there to keep me company, staying awake wasn't very easy. I started setting soft alarms on my phone to go off every hour, just to make sure I didn't sleep through my entire shift. I had been working this job for about 4 months when this happened, and I actually still work there now. It was a regular night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 o'clock and left the building. A couple of minutes later, I got up, started the coffee machine, and then walked down the main hallway to do a general check for anyone still in the building. This was my regular routine just to make myself feel more comfortable. I sat back down at my desk, took out my phone to turn on the alarms, and continued with my work. It was about 20 minutes later when I realized I had never heard the coffee machine beep to indicate it was done. I went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and saw that there was no coffee in the pot. Then I noticed that the entire coffee machine was turned off. I thought it was weird, but that's about it. I just turned it back on and went back to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I noticed my phone wasn't where I had left it on the desk. I patted down my pockets and ran back to the coffee desk, but it wasn't there either. I played it back in my memory and knew for sure that I had placed it right on my desk, next to my keyboard. I started to get really freaked out and looked around frantically. My desk was in the middle of a large room with other desks and computers, and I suddenly felt like I was being watched. Standing there, knowing someone else had to be in the building with me, I nervously called out in a shaky voice, hoping my friend was just playing a prank on me. I waited for a few seconds, but there was no reply. As I stood by my desk, another few seconds passed before I heard soft shuffling coming from behind a desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after, my phone alarm rang from the opposite corner of the room. My first thought was that there were probably 2 unknown strangers in the room with me. Instinctively, I started running for the door. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I made it out, but I didn't take any chances. I ran across the street to a neighboring gas station and called 911 from their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I expected and searched the building. They brought out a man after only a few minutes, though I didn't recognize him at all. They also retrieved my phone, which they found behind some boxes in the corner of the office. The man was found with a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we got more information about what had really taken place. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired recently, before I started working there. He told the police he was trying to scare me to get me to leave the building so he could take back his company laptop. Apparently, he had information he wanted from it, at least that's what he claimed. It all seemed really weird to me, and I wasn't sure if I trusted his reasoning for breaking in. However, my coworkers did say they remembered the guy, and he was definitely a little strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, because I'm not sure what would have happened if his plan hadn't worked and I had chosen to stay in the building. I work at a small retail store. It shouldn't be any surprise to hear that I hate it there. The work, the customers, even some of the coworkers. But it's my first job and really the only one I was able to get with no experience. Over winter break, my school was out for 3 weeks, which meant I wasn't forced to only work closing shifts. I talked to my manager, who said I could take up a few overnight shifts if I wanted. I gladly accepted, knowing I wouldn't have to deal with customers and could mostly work at my own pace. I knew the overnight manager, Chris, and when I came in for my first overnight, he showed me what to get done and left me to do it. It was just the two of us, working on opposite ends of the store. Being overnight, though, it was really nice getting to work in peace and even listen to music as I did. But it only took a couple of hours for the fun of it to wear off. I was actually getting really bored and even a little sleepy, not talking to a single person. It was just past 1 a.m., so I let Chris know I was going to take my 15. I grabbed my lunch from the fridge in the break room, then left the building and sat in my car. I scarfed down my food, hoping to have 10 minutes for a quick nap. But before I rested my eyes, I noticed someone standing next to the building. The entire parking lot was empty and dark, with only the lights from inside the retail store on, so there was no reason for anyone to be there. The guy was looking into the windows like he was trying to see inside. It was so odd that I felt like I had to stay awake to watch him. He looked like a pretty tall guy with short hair, wearing a dark leather jacket and some old boots. I watched him for the rest of my break, so a whole 10 minutes, and the guy still stood outside just watching through the windows of our store. When it was time to clock back in, I got out and started walking toward the front doors. I was walking fast, hoping to slip by without the guy having a chance to stop me. But before I even got halfway through the parking lot, he spun around and looked at me. His eyes were dead and sleepless, and he had a blank face. I kept walking, trying to make it to the door, but the guy immediately started walking toward me. He was maybe 10 feet away as I came up and started unlocking the door. He called out to me as I hurried inside and locked it behind me. I just ignored him out of a gut feeling that he was up to no good. Maybe it was harsh of me to not at least see what he wanted, but at the time I just had a really bad feeling about him. I made my way to the back to use the bathroom, then was back on the sales floor a few minutes later. I wanted to get back to work, but I felt tempted to check on the front windows and see if the guy was still creeping around out there. So I walked up to the front, expecting to see his creepy eyes staring through the window, but he wasn't there, not even anywhere in the parking lot. I figured he had left for good, so I went back to the aisle I was working in. Another few minutes went by. It was probably 1:30 by now, when suddenly the alarm sounded through the building. I knew exactly what it was right away. It was the back door in the storage area of the building. Sometimes the managers would toss stuff in the dumpster out back and accidentally trip the alarm, but with only Chris working, it seemed really unlikely. I started making my way to the back of the store, but the closer I got to the doors of the storage room, the more that bad feeling crept up inside me. If it was Chris, surely he would have shut off the alarm by now. Then I got to the back, and just before I entered, I heard a bunch of thuds coming from the other side. I quickly pushed open the door, and the sound stopped. Down the large hallway, I could see the back door wide open, and there was no sign of Chris anywhere. "Chris," I called out. He didn't respond, but a moment later, a head peered around the corner on the other end of the hallway. I recognized that man's creepy, dead look right away, and felt my whole body tense up. After hesitating, I went right back the way I came, not stopping for anything until I got outside and into my car. I called 911, and it was as I did that I realized I still had no idea where Chris was. Cops arrived quickly, running into the building and searching the whole place. Thankfully, they found Chris unharmed. He had locked himself in the manager's office after the guy broke in and chased him. He also explained the thud noises I heard. saying the man was pounding on the office door, trying to break it down. The guy ran away as soon as I did, so he was gone before the cops could get to him. We have a blurry image of his face from the security cameras, printed out and hung up on the back wall so other employees can keep a lookout for him. As far as we know, he hasn't come back, and there's no telling what he was trying to do that night. I'm just lucky that my gut feeling was working well. It was just past 11 p.m., and I was in the back room of our building, moving boxes around. It was just a regular hardware store, and I was an overnight stalker there. My coworker, who I usually worked with, was on vacation, so it was just me for the night. I didn't mind, though, because people always expect less from you when you're left alone to do all the work. So, if anything didn't get done, it wouldn't really matter. I was working slowly, taking my time. All the deliveries that came in during the day needed to be placed in the aisles where they belonged. I was breaking down pallets and putting boxes on carts that I would then roll into the main shopping area to stock. Once I had filled a few carts, I grabbed one and pushed it to the aisle on the far left. It was raining or maybe even storming pretty heavily outside. Through the rain, I thought I heard something from the front of the building. I didn't really care, not even crossing my mind for a second that it was anything other than the building making noises. I took a few boxes and started stocking, humming to myself to stave off the boredom. But then, again, I thought I heard something. I walked down to the front of the store and looked all the way to the other end where the front door was. There didn't seem to be anything or anyone. I stayed there for a little bit in no rush to work. Then it happened again. I could have sworn this time that I saw something moving by the front door, and that was where the sound seemed to come from. Being in my place of work with all the doors locked, I wasn't really afraid of anything, but I just wanted to make sure nothing strange was going on outside. I went up to the front door and looked out the glass, which I noticed had huge smudges and scratches on it. Nothing was outside. No cars or people. Just heavy rain pouring down. I turned and started walking away, back to where I was working. It was quiet for a while, maybe a whole hour even. But then the sound came again from the front door. I dropped what I was doing immediately and walked back to the front. From across the store, I could clearly make out a figure moving around outside the door. I began walking closer before the figure stopped, stood still for a second, then ran away. I ran up to the door, trying to catch a glimpse of the person, but it was too dark and rainy. Looking at the door, though, there were definitely more marks on it than before. I was confident that this person was trying to break in. I pulled out my phone, still standing by the door, and called the police. The operator said it wouldn't be too long, just a few minutes. I put my phone back in my pocket and waited by the door, looking around. The parking lot was still empty, but then I turned my head to look against the building, and on the side was that same figure. I backed away quickly, worried that he may have seen me. I took several steps back and tried to be quiet. Not even 10 seconds later, the figure appeared right outside the door. While the glass was somewhat foggy and had raindrops all over it, I could tell he was looking at me. He slammed something against the window. It looked like maybe a large rock. Then he hit it again and again, trying to break the glass. I backed away faster and ran to the back of the store, locking myself in the office. Through the building, I heard the glass shatter and the alarm by the door go off. I waited in fear, hearing nothing else. A few minutes of silence passed, and I was growing more and more nervous until the police finally showed up. I heard them call out and walk around, searching the place before they got to the office, where I identified myself and told them what I knew. The guy wasn't in the store, so I guess after he broke the glass, he just left. Seems really weird and doesn't make any sense. part of me even wishes that he had actually stolen something so that I'd at least know that was what he was after. But given that he didn't do anything after breaking down the door, I don't know what he wanted. And that is what still scares me to this day. I'm a receptionist at a local hotel, and most of my shifts are overnight. I'm in charge of the front desk, and my main responsibilities are to check in guests, answer phone calls, and keep an eye on the security cameras. It's usually a pretty quiet job since our hotel isn't the biggest or busiest. On this particular night, the hotel was mostly empty. There were only a few guests staying with us. I was sitting at the front desk on my phone when I saw a man start walking toward the doors outside. I stood up and greeted him when he came inside. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I need a room for the night." He was definitely high on something, but regardless, I checked him in and gave him a key to his room. It was standard to allow walk-in bookings when the hotel was less than 75% full. He started walking toward the elevators, and I sat back down and pulled out my phone. A few hours later, I was sitting at the front desk when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a thump, sounding like a door trying to be forced open. I got up and walked around the corner to the end of the hallway. The man I had checked in a few hours ago was standing there, trying to open one of our maintenance doors. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. He looked over at me with those creepy eyes and asked again, but he just stared at me. I wasn't really sure what to think. Maybe he was really high and looking for the vending machine or something. I didn't know. I didn't want to anger the man, though, so I went back to my desk and tried to forget about it. A good amount of time passed with no activity. There were no sounds from any of the rooms, and nobody entered the building or walked through the halls. It was around 3 in the morning when I did a small walk around the bottom floor just to keep myself awake and busy. As I got to the hallway by the front desk, though, I heard a very sudden loud banging coming from one of the rooms. I stopped and listened for a moment, then went up the stairs to the second floor, where I thought it came from. It was very quiet now, which made me somewhat nervous. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing, but when I reached the end, one of the room's doors was open. I listened again for a second before lightly knocking. Nobody responded. I cautiously peeked inside, unsure of what to expect. It seemed empty. I wasn't comfortable walking all the way inside, though, so I couldn't really look around, but I was sure nobody was inside. I closed the door and looked at the room number, 112. That was the room I'd given to the man, but I never saw him exit the building. I quickly walked back down to the front desk and looked at all the security cameras we had in the lobby and outside the building, but the man didn't turn up. I jumped when the hotel phone rang. One of the rooms was calling. I picked it up. "Hello, how can I help you?" There was a woman on the line telling me about some man knocking on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured her I would take care of it. I hung up and took a deep breath. I was getting really nervous now. I walked around the desk, but then again the phone started ringing. It was someone else from a different room this time, saying he had the same experience as the other woman. Someone knocking at his door in the middle of the night. I called the police right away and stood by the front doors until they arrived, just in case I needed a quick escape. Luckily, they came before anything happened, but they didn't find the man. Instead, they found a broken window in his room where he likely jumped out. It was on the second story, though, so I'm not sure how he managed to get away without some major injuries. Later, while the police were still searching, they got a report that the car he used to pay for the room was stolen. It's unclear what the man intended to do or why he was knocking on people's doors. I'm thankful none of them opened their doors, though, because this case could have been much worse if they had. Being a police officer in a small town has its perks and its drawbacks. On one hand, you know everyone and everyone knows you. But on the other hand, it means you're the first to hear about every odd occurrence, every whispered rumor that circulates through the community. Most of the time, it's nothing, just local gossip or harmless misunderstandings. But every so often, you get a weird call. This is one of those calls. The call came in on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was sitting in my patrol car, sipping on a lukewarm cup of coffee, when the radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost indifferent, as she relayed the details. A hiker had reported seeing an old man in the woods just outside of town, acting strangely. The hiker described him as disoriented, wandering aimlessly, and muttering to himself. It didn't sound like much, but in a town like ours, even a minor incident could lead to something more serious. The woods weren't far from the old state highway, a place where people occasionally got lost or injured. I figured it was worth checking out, if only to ensure the man was all right and to bring him back to town if he needed help. I radioed back that I'd take the call and started the drive out to the woods. The road was narrow and winding, lined with towering trees that seemed to close in around me as I drove deeper into the forest. The leaves had turned shades of red, orange, and gold, carpeting the ground in a blanket of color. It was the kind of scene that people come from miles around to see. But today it felt different, darker, more foreboding. As I reached the trailhead where the hiker had last seen the man, I parked the car and got out, taking in the stillness of the woods. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. I grabbed my flashlight, even though it was still daylight, and started down the trail. The trail was narrow, with trees so close together that they blocked out much of the sunlight. I walked slowly, scanning the area for any sign of the old man. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves, were absent. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath. After about 20 minutes of walking, I noticed something off to the side of the trail. A faint path, barely visible, leading deeper into the woods. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, the ground overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. But something about it caught my attention, a gut feeling that this was the way to go. I turned onto the path and followed it as it wound its way deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow taller and denser, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking out the light. The air grew cooler, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. And then I saw him. He was standing just off the path, his back to me, staring at something in the distance. He was tall and thin, his clothes old and worn, hanging loosely on his frail frame. His hair was white and unkempt, falling around his shoulders like a tangled curtain. From where I stood, I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and raspy. "Sir," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm and non-threatening. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just kept staring into the distance, his hands clasped in front of him, his head slightly tilted as if he was listening to something only he could hear. I took a step closer, my hand resting on my radio. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need help?" Again, no response. I was close enough now to see that his clothes were covered in dirt and leaves, as if he'd been out here for days, maybe even weeks. His skin was pale, almost gray, and there was a strange smell in the air, like damp earth and decay. "Sir," I tried again, taking another step forward, and that's when he turned around. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, and his skin was stretched tight over his skull, giving him a skeletal appearance. But it was his eyes that sent a jolt of fear through me, pale and glassy, like those of a dead fish, staring at me without any hint of recognition or emotion. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. There was something deeply wrong with this man, something that went beyond simple disorientation or confusion. He turned and started walking away, moving with a strange, stiff gait that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to follow him, to try to help him. But another part of me, the part that was screaming at me to get out of there, kept me rooted to the spot. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the shadows until he was completely out of sight. The forest seemed to swallow him whole, silence pressing in around me like a physical weight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. My training told me to follow him, to make sure he was okay. My instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of the woods as fast as I could. But before I could make a decision, I heard something. A rustling sound coming from the direction the old man had gone. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, closer, until it was right on top of me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the thick underbrush. But the sound was still there, moving through the woods, circling me, growing louder with each passing second. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my radio. I had to call for backup, had to get someone out here with me. But just as I reached for the radio, the sound stopped, the woods falling silent once again. And then I felt it. A presence right behind me, so close I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the empty trail stretching out into the shadows. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something watching me, something waiting just out of sight. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the shadows just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. It was a sound I'd never heard before, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I took a step back, my hand reaching for my gun. But before I could draw it, the growl grew louder, more insistent. It was coming closer, whatever it was, closing in on me, trapping me in its invisible grasp. The sun had nearly set by now, the forest bathed in the dim light of twilight. The shadows were long, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I was alone, miles from the nearest house, the nearest road. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and that low, ominous growl echoing through the trees. I forced myself to move, my legs heavy as I took a step back. Then another. The growl followed me, growing louder, closer, closer, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the ground as I sprinted back down the trail. The branches whipped against my face, the underbrush snagging at my clothes, but I didn't stop, didn't look back. All I could think about was getting out, getting back to my car, getting away from whatever was out there. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me, the shadows growing darker, deeper. I could still hear the growl following me, chasing me, a relentless predator hunting its prey. Finally, I burst out of the woods, the trailhead coming into view, my patrol car parked just where I'd left it. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me. It wasn't until I was back in town, the bright lights of the streets coming into view, that I finally allowed myself to breathe, to let go of the fear that had gripped me so tightly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I still think about that night, still wonder what was really out there in the woods. And every time I drive past the trailhead, I feel a chill run down my spine, a cold reminder of the fear I felt that day. Sometimes, when you venture too far into the unknown, you might find more than you bargained for. You might find something that was waiting for you all along. It was supposed to be just another job. My first assignment as a plumber for a small local company. I was excited to finally put my skills to use and earn some money. Little did I know, my first day would turn into a nightmare that I could never have imagined. The call came in early in the morning. An old mansion on the outskirts of town had a plumbing issue, and the owner wanted it fixed as soon as possible. I loaded up my tools and drove out to the address, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. When I arrived, I was struck by the mansion's grandeur. It was an imposing 3-story structure with ivy creeping up the stone walls. The windows were large and ornate, but many were covered with heavy drapes, blocking any view inside. As I walked up to the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The door creaked open before I could knock, and an elderly man with piercing blue eyes and a stern expression stood in the doorway. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, the owner of the mansion. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "There's a problem with the pipes in the basement. I need it fixed immediately." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I'll take a look and see what needs to be done." He led me through a dimly lit hallway to the basement door. As we descended the narrow staircase, the air grew colder and damper. The basement was a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, filled with old furniture and dusty relics. Mr. Blackwood pointed to a section of exposed pipes in the far corner of the basement. "There," he said, "the leak is somewhere in that area." I set to work, examining the pipes and trying to locate the source of the leak. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice strange noises coming from deeper within the basement. It sounded like whispers, barely audible but persistent. "Is someone else down here?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "No," Mr. Blackwood replied curtly. "Just you and me." I nodded and continued working, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the whispers were distracting, making it hard to concentrate. After a while, I noticed a small door partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look. As I pushed the door open, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The room was filled with strange occult symbols painted on the walls and floor. In the center of the room was a large wooden table covered with bizarre objects. Candles, animal bones, and what looked like ancient manuscripts. "What is this?" I muttered to myself, feeling a surge of fear. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mr. Blackwood standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This room is off limits." "I'm sorry," I stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just curious." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said. "I suggest you finish your work and leave." I nodded quickly and hurried back to the pipes, my heart pounding. As I resumed my work, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they seemed to be coming from all around me. Finally, I located the source of the leak and fixed it. I packed up my tools and made my way back upstairs, eager to leave the mansion as quickly as possible. Mr. Blackwood was waiting for me at the top of the stairs. "Is the job done?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, handing him the invoice. "The leak is fixed. You shouldn't have any more problems." He nodded, taking the invoice from my hand. "Good. You can see yourself out." I left the mansion, my mind racing with questions. What was that room? And what were those whispers? I tried to put it out of my mind, but the experience left me feeling deeply unsettled. The next morning, I returned to the office and told my boss about the job. He listened carefully, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "I've heard stories about that mansion," he said, "rumors of strange occurrences and dark rituals. But I never thought they were true." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Blackwood is a recluse," he explained. "Hardly anyone ever sees him, and those who do often report strange experiences. You might have stumbled upon something you weren't supposed to see." I shuddered at the thought. "What should I do?" "Just stay away from that place," he advised. "And if you ever hear those whispers again, don't ignore them." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and relief. I was glad to be away from the mansion, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking in that basement, and the memory of those whispers haunted my dreams. "3 years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms. Painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite. But when the hallucinations started, that's when I knew I had something really serious. Laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call Mom from downstairs. We don't have any kids. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway and called my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I had from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For the second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. It said, "Hello." I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out, telling him I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house and that I thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was over the phone, so he left work early to bring me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I changed out of my pajamas. While doing so, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was mid-throwing up, I heard another voice from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't make out what it said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voice I heard. I was losing my mind. I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital. Apparently, if untreated, what I had could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor told me the hallucinations were unusual, but not unheard of. I was given antibiotics through a needle shortly after I arrived at the hospital with my husband. The doctor told me I was fortunate to have come to the hospital so quickly, as if I had waited much longer, this could have had lasting effects or possibly been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours. I was told I would have to stay in the hospital for a few days to a week, given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, my husband left to go home because he had work the next day. The nurse told me to call her if I had any issues. Though I still felt like absolute death, I nodded off pretty quickly. I started having this dream where my ex-husband was in the room, standing over my bed, looking down at me and talking. He was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay, and that he came as soon as he saw my husband leave. He went into this rant about how he despised my current husband and wanted to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead and then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, and why it ended, which I'd rather not include here. I woke up in a drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. It wasn't like that when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning to the nurse in the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had. She paused and then told me that wasn't a dream. Your cousin came to visit you last night. I told her I don't have any cousins that live in the state. She looked more serious now and said, well, someone who said they're your cousin, David, visited you late last night. David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining better, the nurse got a doctor. The doctor told me the antibiotics might have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness. Hence why I so vividly heard what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and of course, he was livid and concerned. He came back again that night after work. But that day, I texted David asking what the hell he was thinking visiting me, and how he knew I was in the hospital. My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up telling him I heard all of his threats toward my husband and that I'd be getting the police involved. Minutes later, he responded, saying, I never made any threats toward your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. You must have heard things in your sleep. I responded, stay out of my life, or I'll get the police involved. He didn't respond after that. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my drowsy, half-asleep state, because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of the antibiotics and already having weird audible hallucinations the day before, I don't think it's impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said. But I could be wrong. I left the hospital the next week. As a police officer, you get used to the noise, the bustle, and the unpredictable nature of people and their troubles. But every so often, you come across something that shakes you to your core, something that doesn't fit into the neat little boxes you've built for the world. It was a quiet, overcast afternoon when the call came in. The kind of day where the sky is a flat gray blanket, and everything feels muffled, like the world is holding its breath. I was at the station, wrapping up some paperwork when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. A young boy, 8 years old, had been reported missing by his mother. She'd last seen him playing in their front yard, and now he was gone without a trace. I felt a familiar knot of concern in my stomach as I grabbed my gear and headed out. Missing kids were always a priority, and time was of the essence. The boy's house was in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, bordered by a thick expanse of woods that stretched for miles. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this call was different, something that didn't sit right with me. I pulled up to the house, a small place with a neatly manicured lawn. The mother was waiting on the porch, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She was wringing her hands, her whole body tense with fear. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to find him. He's never run off like this before." I nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "We'll do everything we can to find him, ma'am. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "He was playing in the yard. Right there," she said, pointing to a small patch of grass near the fence. "I was inside, just for a minute, getting him some water. When I came back out, he was gone. I looked everywhere, called his name, but he didn't answer. He's never gone into the woods alone. He knows better. I followed her gaze to the edge of the yard, where the fence ended and the woods began. The trees were tall and dense, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. The entrance to the woods was marked by a narrow, well-worn path, the kind kids might use to explore or play games of make-believe. "Did you check the woods?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't want to go in there alone. I thought maybe he just wandered off, that he'd come back if I waited. But he didn't." I radioed for backup, requesting additional units to help with the search, and then turned back to the mother. "We'll start by searching the woods. If he's in there, we'll find him." She nodded, her eyes wide with worry. "Please, find him." I gave her a reassuring nod and set off toward the path, my flashlight in hand. Even though it was still daylight, the woods were thick. The trees towered overhead, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves and underbrush. As I walked, I called out the boy's name, my voice echoing through the trees. But there was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the distant calls of birds. I kept moving, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of him. A footprint, a piece of clothing, anything. The deeper I went, the more the unease in my gut grew. The woods were too quiet, too still, as if the very air was holding its breath. I've spent plenty of time in the woods before, but there was something different about this place, something that made my skin crawl. After what felt like hours of searching, I finally spotted something. A small, worn sneaker, half buried in the leaves. My heart leaped into my throat as I hurried over, picking it up. It was a child's shoe, the kind that could easily belong to an 8-year-old boy. "Over here," I called out to the other officers who had joined the search, my voice strained with urgency. They came running, their faces grim as they took in the sight of the shoe. We fanned out, searching the area with renewed intensity, but there was no sign of the boy. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but that single solitary shoe. The day wore on, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We combed through the woods, calling his name, searching every inch of ground, but it was no use. The boy was gone, and no one had any answers. I returned to the house as dusk began to settle, my heart heavy with the weight of failure. The mother was sitting on the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, and I didn't have the heart to tell her what I knew deep down, that we weren't going to find him. Not today, maybe not ever. "We'll keep looking," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll bring in more officers, search teams, dogs. We won't stop until we find him." She nodded, but I could see the despair in her eyes, the way her hope was slipping away bit by bit. "Thank you, officer. Please find my boy." I left her there on the porch, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the evening, and headed back to my car. But as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something strange. A faint sound coming from the direction of the woods. It was so soft I almost missed it, but when I stopped to listen, I heard it clearly. A distant, echoing call, like a child's voice. My blood ran cold. It was his voice, I was sure of it. But it didn't sound right. It didn't sound natural. It was distorted, almost mechanical, like a recording played on a loop. "Help me." The words sent a shiver down my spine, freezing me in place. The sound was coming from deep in the woods, far beyond where we'd searched. I knew I should call for backup, should wait for the others to arrive, but something compelled me to move, to follow that voice. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the trail, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers, blocking out what little light remained. The voice called out again, closer now, but still distant, as if it was leading me deeper into the forest. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to find that boy, had to bring him home. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around me until I could barely see the sky through the thick canopy of leaves. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, making my skin crawl. I shone my flashlight around, trying to get my bearings, but the beam only revealed more of the same. Endless trees, endless darkness. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. Something small and pale, just at the edge of my light. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer, the beam revealing more and more of the figure. It was the boy. He was standing there, barefoot, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes wide and empty. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about the way he looked, the way he stood so still, so unnatural. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you okay? Let's get you out of here, all right?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, his face expressionless. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's okay. I'm here to help. Let's go back to your mom. She's waiting for you." But still, he didn't move. And that's when I realized he wasn't really looking at me. He was looking past me, into the darkness behind me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I slowly turned, shining my flashlight into the shadows. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving, something watching. I turned back to the boy, but he was gone, vanished into the night without a sound. Panic surged through me as I called out his name, but there was no response, just the echo of my own voice, swallowed by the darkness. I tried to retrace my steps, tried to find the path back to the house, but everything looked the same. Every tree, every shadow. I was lost, trapped in the endless maze of the forest with no way out. The night had fully descended now, the darkness absolute. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, the rush of blood in my ears. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard it again, that voice calling out from the darkness. "Help me!" It was the boy's voice, but it was different now. Distorted, twisted, like a recording played backward. The sound sent chills down my spine, my mind racing with fear. I knew I should run, should get out of there, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the voice grew louder, closer. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of my light. It was the boy, or at least it looked like him. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling. His eyes were empty, hollow, his face pale and expressionless. He was standing perfectly still, staring at me with those empty eyes, as if waiting for something. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, his mouth slightly open as if he was about to speak. And then, slowly, he raised his hand, pointing past me into the darkness. I turned, following his gaze, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving through the trees, coming closer, faster. My heart leaped into my throat as I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I tried to get a better look. But the shadow was gone. vanished into the night as quickly as it had appeared. I turned back to the boy, but he was gone too, leaving me alone in the darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, my footsteps echoing through the trees as I searched for a way out, for any sign of the path back to the house. But the woods seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. Finally, I broke through the trees, stumbling out onto the road, my chest heaving with exertion. I could see the lights of the house in the distance, a beacon of safety in the darkness. But as I reached the house, I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. The mother was still sitting on the porch, her eyes wide with fear. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, into the darkness of the woods. And then, slowly, she raised her hand, pointing toward the trees. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just grabbed her hand and led her inside, locking the door behind us. We waited there in the darkness, listening for any sound, any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing, just the silence, thick and oppressive, pressing in on us from all sides. I never saw the boy again, never found out what happened to him. But I know he's still out there somewhere in those woods. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I can still hear that voice calling out from the darkness, echoing through the trees. Help me, but I know better now. I know it's not really him, it's something else. Something that's been waiting in the shadows for a long time, and it's still waiting. The vanishing boy was more than just a missing person. It was a glimpse into something darker, something that defies explanation. The fear I felt that day, the way those woods seemed to come alive with shadows and whispers, it's something I'll never forget. Starting a new job can be nerve-wracking, especially when it's your first day working in a nursing home. I had always wanted to help people, and this job seemed like the perfect opportunity to make a difference. Little did I know, my first day would turn into a nightmarish experience that I would never forget. The nursing home was an old, sprawling building with long, dimly lit hallways and a slightly musty smell that seemed to cling to everything. I arrived early in the afternoon, eager to get started. The head nurse, Mrs. Jenkins, gave me a tour of the facility, introducing me to the staff and residents. One of the residents stood out to me immediately. Mr. Thompson was an elderly man with advanced dementia. He had a frail frame and a distant look in his eyes, as if he were always lost in his own world. Mrs. Jenkins warned me that he could be unpredictable and sometimes agitated, but he was generally harmless. As the day went on, I got to know the other residents and settled into my new routine. Dinner time came, and I helped serve meals and assist those who needed help eating. Mr. Thompson sat at his table, staring blankly at his food. I approached him, trying to make conversation. "Hi, Mr. Thompson. How are you feeling today?" I asked, giving him a warm smile. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice shaky. "No, sir. I'm new here," I replied, feeling a bit uneasy under his intense gaze. "I'm here to help you with anything you need." He stared at me for a long moment before muttering, "You look familiar." I brushed it off as a symptom of his dementia and continued with my duties. As the evening progressed, I noticed Mr. Thompson becoming increasingly agitated. He would mutter to himself, occasionally glancing over at me with a look of suspicion. Later that night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a commotion coming from Mr. Thompson's room. I rushed over and found him standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wild with fear. I tried to calm him down, but he was inconsolable. Mrs. Jenkins arrived and helped me get him back into bed. She explained that he often had episodes like this and that it was best to let him rest. As I left his room, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on my work, but the thought lingered. Around midnight, I was doing my final rounds before my shift ended. The nursing home was quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old building. As I passed Mr. Thompson's room, I heard a faint noise. I paused, listening closely. It sounded like whispering. I slowly pushed open the door and peeked inside. The room was dimly lit by the small lamp on the bedside table. Mr. Thompson was lying in bed, his eyes closed, but the whispering continued, growing louder. "Who's there?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. I took a step back, feeling a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, Mr. Thompson's eyes snapped open, and he sat up in bed. "They're here," he said, his voice trembling. "They're in the basement." A wave of fear washed over me. I wanted to leave, to run as far away as possible, but something compelled me to find out what he was talking about. I left his room and made my way to the basement, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was even darker and colder than the rest of the building. I could hear the faint sound of water dripping and the occasional rustle of something moving in the shadows. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. As I turned a corner, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the basement. It was a tall, shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as I approached the figure, which became clearer with each step. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I realized it was just an old coat rack draped with a dusty coat. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling foolish for being so scared, but then I heard the whispering again, louder this time. I turned around and saw another figure, this one definitely human, standing in the shadows. It was a man, his face obscured by darkness. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The man stepped forward, his face coming into the light. It was Mr. Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, you shouldn't be down here," I said, feeling a mix of confusion and fear. "Let's get you back to your room." He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No, you don't understand. They're here. They're coming for us." I took a step back, my mind racing. Was he hallucinating, or was there something more to his fear? Before I could say anything, I heard a loud crash behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the source of the noise. The basement door had slammed shut, and the whispering grew louder, almost deafening. I grabbed Mr. Thompson's arm and pulled him towards the stairs. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. As we climbed the stairs, the whispering followed us, growing more frantic. We reached the top, and I pushed the door open, leading Mr. Thompson back to his room. I got him into bed, his eyes still wide with fear. "They won't stop," he whispered, clutching my hand. "They'll never stop." I left his room, my heart pounding in my chest. I found Mrs. Jenkins and told her what had happened. She looked concerned but tried to reassure me. "It's just his dementia," she said. "He gets confused and scared. There's nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The fear in Mr. Thompson's eyes, the whispering, the shadowy figure. It all felt too real. The next day, I handed in my resignation. The experience had shaken me to my core, and I couldn't bring myself to return to that place. As I left, I glanced back at the nursing home, wondering what secrets it held. I once matched with this girl on Tinder, and we're still friends. Her name is Francesca. She seemed cool right from the start. She had a sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, red highlights in her hair, and in her profile she mentioned that she loved to work out. One of her pictures was taken on the rooftop of this cool-looking building with an amazing view. I asked her where it was, and she told me it was some abandoned hospital on the edge of town that was super cool to explore at night and easy to get into. She said there was usually one cop patrolling the huge parking lot at night to deter trespassers, but it was easy to get around. She came up with the idea of us going there together as our first date, if you want to call it a date. I was totally on board. She seemed cool, and it was a different kind of way to meet someone, instead of the usual let's get drinks. I picked her up from her house, which was just 10 minutes away, and then we drove the 20 minutes to get to the hospital. Those 20 minutes gave us a nice chance to get to know each other and get comfortable with each other's personalities. When we got to the hospital, she told me to park on this dead-end street hidden by a bunch of tall bushes, which was about a 5-minute walk to the hospital entrance. We hopped over a small barrier separating the road from the hospital parking lot and jogged across the wide-open lot toward the grass near the entrance she always used. She led us to this broken window leading to the hospital basement. Seemed creepy, but I signed up for this. I was glad I wore ragged jeans like she suggested because I knew I'd end up ripping them on something. We used our phone flashlights. We didn't bring any special heavy-duty lights or anything. Francesca seemed to know this whole hospital like the back of her hand. She led us to a stairway going upstairs. I've got to admit, being alone with just one other person in a place like this at night was pretty scary, but I had no idea how much scarier it was about to get. On the first floor, Francesca kept talking really loudly. I almost wanted to tell her to keep it down. I was paranoid that we'd get caught because of how loud her voice was. Then, down the corridor, we heard the sound of a door opening or closing. Something echoed down the hallway toward us. She heard it too and went silent. I whispered to her, "Is it normal for others to be here?" She responded, "Sometimes, but not really." We turned off our flashlights and waited. Suddenly, there was a bang much closer this time. We both scrambled in the dark. I barely managed to follow her. We made it back to the stairway and ran up the stairs with our lights back on. When we were a couple of levels higher, we felt safe enough to speak at a normal volume again. Francesca said the police never come inside, so it might have been other explorers, but the weird thing was we didn't see any lights down that corridor. Nobody normal would be walking in the dark without a light. Then we heard noises coming from the stairwell we had just left. Someone was coming up the stairs. Once again, we scrambled. She led the way, saying she knew where to go. We ran for a few minutes through the maze of the building. I was freaking out, feeling like we were being followed. I wasn't sure if I'd rather it be the cops or someone else. She led us to this outdoor spot, not quite the highest rooftop, but a level that felt like a rooftop. We stopped to catch our breath. The whole being followed thing was totally killing the vibe. Even she seemed concerned, and I had looked to her as the expert of this place. After a few minutes, we relaxed a bit and went through a broken window into the ceiling of this large room. This part was terrifying because she wanted to walk along these long, narrow wooden planks with a 10-foot drop below. A fall from that height would definitely cause an injury, but I didn't want to seem like a wimp, so I followed her. We crossed the sketchy wooden board until we reached a pillar where one plank ended, and another began. We sat on the pillar, dangling our legs over the edge, looking down into the darkness below. It was creepy, but I thought we were alone, until we heard a noise from below. It sounded like footsteps. Our presence was already known, so we turned on our flashlights and aimed them down. Right below us, standing at the base of the pillar, was a man in his 40s wearing a black Carhartt beanie, a black jacket, and black sweatpants. He smiled up at us and said in a deep, creepy voice, "Come on down," while waving at us. I asked, "Are you police?" He ignored my question and repeated, "Come on down," with that same creepy smile. Francesca and I stood up, terrified, and started walking back across the narrow plank. Now I was even more scared of falling. I had no idea what that man would do if he caught us. As we were halfway across, the man hurried out of the room through a door. He was definitely going to try and catch us. We had to move fast. We made it across and started rushing down the stairs, knowing that man was dangerous. As we descended the stair shaft on the opposite side of the hospital, we heard a door a few flights above us slam open and then footsteps stomping down the stairs. Somehow he had followed us. We were running as if our lives depended on it. We made it back to the first floor, then ran to the basement where we had entered. We climbed through the broken window, the process hauntingly slow. I went out second and was terrified that the man would grab my legs at any moment. But by then, I think we had lost him. We ran across the parking lot, back to my car. The first thing we did was lock the doors and catch our breath. It was a complete nightmare, but somehow, going through that together created an instant bond between us. We drove away and stopped at a Wendy's to grab some food and collect our thoughts. We sat in the car for an hour just talking, and then I dropped her off. Francesca and I stayed romantically involved for a few months, but we eventually just became good friends. Neither of us ever returned to that hospital again. There's a certain routine you develop as a police officer, a rhythm to the work that over time becomes second nature. You respond to calls, assess situations, and deal with whatever comes your way. Most nights, it's the usual: domestic disputes, traffic stops, the occasional petty theft. But every once in a while, you get a call that shakes you to your core. A call that breaks the rhythm and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew. This is one of those calls, a night I still can't fully explain, and one that has left me with more questions than answers. It was one of those nights where the air felt thick, almost oppressive, like a storm was about to break. I was nearing the end of my shift, looking forward to getting home and unwinding after a long day. The streets were quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. I was cruising down a deserted road when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, informing me of a 911 call from an elderly woman who lived alone in an old house far from downtown. The report was vague. Something about a woman in her house acting strangely, refusing to leave. The dispatcher didn't have many details, just that the woman seemed frightened and insisted she needed help. I sighed, turning my car in the direction of the address. It sounded like a routine welfare check, maybe a case of dementia or confusion, but I had a job to do, so I responded and headed to the scene. The house was easy enough to find. A small, weathered structure set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes. It looked like it had been there for centuries, the paint peeling, the windows clouded with dirt. A single porch light flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the front yard. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth, the kind of smell that signals an impending storm. As I approached the front door, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough for a sliver of light to escape from inside. I paused, my hand hovering over the handle of my flashlight, a sudden unease settling in my gut. It wasn't unusual for people to leave their doors unlocked in this part of town, but something about this felt wrong. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the light coming from an old lamp in the corner of the living room. The place had the musty smell of disuse, the air heavy and stale. I called out, announcing my presence, but there was no response. Just the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and began to make my way through the house. It was a small, cluttered place filled with old furniture and knickknacks, the kind you'd expect to find in a home that hadn't been updated in years. The living room led into a narrow hallway lined with family photos that looked decades old. As I moved deeper into the house, the unease I'd felt earlier began to intensify, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I reached the end of the hallway and found myself standing in front of a closed door. The air was colder here, the light dimmer, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push me back. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about this door, this room, felt wrong, like it was holding something back, something that shouldn't be disturbed. But I had a job to do, so I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and dark, lit only by the faint glow of a single lamp on a bedside table. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled and stained, as if someone had been lying there for days. In the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was the woman who had made the call. She was old, maybe in her late 70s, with thin white hair that fell in tangled strands around her face. She was wearing a nightgown that was too big for her frail frame, the fabric hanging loosely around her thin shoulders. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, staring at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer, but she didn't respond, didn't move. She just stared at me, her eyes unblinking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Ma'am," I repeated, my voice softer this time, trying to coax her out of whatever state she was in. And then, without warning, she began to scoot toward me. It was a slow, jerky movement, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. She didn't use her hands or legs, just her back, her body dragging across the floor in an unnatural way. Her eyes never left mine, wide and unblinking, as she scooted closer and closer. There was something horribly wrong about the way she moved, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out to her again, but she didn't respond, just kept coming, inching closer with that horrible, jerky motion. It was like watching a puppet on a string, her movements mechanical and devoid of life. "Stay back," I warned, my hand hovering over my holster, but she didn't stop. She just kept coming, her eyes wide and vacant, her mouth slightly open as if she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was she having some kind of seizure? A stroke? But no, this was something different, something far more sinister. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the shadows lengthening and twisting in the corners, as if the very house was alive, watching. Suddenly, the woman stopped. She was only a few feet away from me now, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light, her head tilted to the side, her eyes still locked onto mine. And then she spoke. "They're here," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. "They've come for me." A chill ran down my spine, the words sending a wave of fear through my body. I didn't know what she meant, didn't understand who or what they were, but the terror in her voice was unmistakable. "Who's here, ma'am?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but she didn't answer. Instead, she let out a low, keening wail, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing something terrible is about to happen, something you can't escape. And then she lunged at me, It happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment she was on the floor, and the next, she was on her feet, her hands clawing at my uniform, her eyes wild and frantic. I stumbled back, trying to push her away, but she was surprisingly strong for her frail frame. Her nails dug into my skin, her breath hot and foul against my face. "Get them out!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "Get them out of my house!" I finally managed to shove her back, and she fell to the floor, crumpling into a heap. She lay there, sobbing, her body shaking with each ragged breath. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no time to process, because at that moment, I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway. I turned, my hand instinctively going to my weapon, and I saw them. At first, I thought it was just shadows, tricks of the light playing on my tired mind. But as I stared down the dark hallway, I realized they were real, figures, pale and indistinct, moving toward me in the darkness. There were 3 of them, their forms vague and shrouded in shadow, but I could see enough to know they weren't human. They were tall, thin, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, just like the woman's had been. They moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, fixed on me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling, but they didn't respond. They just kept coming, their shapes becoming more defined as they drew closer. I could see their faces now, elongated, featureless, their mouths twisted into grotesque, silent screams. The woman behind me let out another wail, and I realized with a jolt of terror that these were the they she had spoken of. These were the things she had been so afraid of, the things that had come for her, and now they were coming for me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the house as I bolted for the front door. I could hear them behind me, their shuffling footsteps growing louder, closer. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something rotten and old, something that had been buried and forgotten. I burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting me. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until I reached my patrol car. I jumped inside, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the car started. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the house. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the lights of the town finally coming into view. Only then did I pull over, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands still trembling. I called it in, told dispatch what had happened, but I left out the details, the figures, the woman's strange behavior, the things she had said. I knew they wouldn't believe me, that they'd chalk it up to exhaustion or stress. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something real, something that defied explanation. I could still hear that woman's wail in my ears, still see those figures moving toward me in the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly, their mouths twisted into silent screams. The house was abandoned after that night, left to rot and decay. Just another forgotten place on the outskirts of town. I never went back, never tried to find out what had really happened there. Some things are better left unknown, better left in the darkness where they belong. The scooting woman was just the beginning of a nightmare that I'll never forget. A nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The things I saw that night, the things that came for her, they're still out there, just beyond the edge of the light. And if you're ever unlucky enough to encounter them, you'll know what real fear is. Because some things can't be explained, can't be understood, they just are. And that's the scariest thing of all. I'm a 38-year-old male living in northern Canada. This took place when I was 36, so just over 2 years ago. I live alone in a fairly large cabin alongside several other cabins. Our small town is very quiet, and everyone knows everyone. Living in the middle of a forest, I'd go camping, hiking, and hunting all the time. My younger brother lived just a couple of hours north, and we'd often do these sorts of things together. We had planned on going out hunting one last time before winter season began. Whenever I'd go for long trips, I'd tell my neighbors so that they could watch my house and everything. So on Monday evening, I let them know that I was leaving, and the following morning, I packed up my bag and drove further north. It was toward the end of fall, so obviously it was fairly cold, breezy, and snowy. I only planned on being away for a couple of days, though, as my brother and I just wanted to go hunting for a day or two. About halfway there, snow began falling. Not unusual in any way, but after a few more minutes down the road, the snow began to pick up. More and more piled on the small, narrow road. My car wasn't a piece of junk or anything, but it also wasn't a huge snowplow type truck. It was just a regular few-year-old pickup truck that was reliable in all normal conditions. I was about 20 minutes away when, unfortunately, the layer of snow slid under my tires, causing the truck to land on the side of the road in several inches of snow. It wasn't a very chaotic crash, but I knew pretty much right away that this wasn't going to be an easy hole to dig myself out of. Of course, I quickly tried a few times to simply drive the truck out, but it wasn't moving. The tires were spinning with no traction at all, so I put on my heavy jacket and hopped out to see what I could do. The road was slightly uphill, which made the situation even worse, not to mention that the snow was still pouring down. After a quick circle around my truck, I knew there was no way for me to get this out alone. I got back inside and weighed my options. I had no service, so calling my brother for help wouldn't work, but I sent a text anyway in hopes that it may somehow end up being sent. The only two options I really had were to either stay and hope that someone happened to drive by and help, or get out and walk to my brother's town, which would take about 2 to 3 hours. I knew this road was practically unused, and the chances of someone driving by and getting out to help were slim at best. The sun was still out, and I was worried that if I didn't do something soon, I could be stuck in the middle of the vast, empty forest during a freezing night. So I decided to walk. I grabbed my hunting rifle along with my pistol holstered to my waist and emptied my bag of everything that I didn't need for the walk. All I had to do was follow the road, so getting lost wasn't too much of a worry of mine, but getting stranded in the cold was. The snow on the road wasn't too thick yet, and after 30 minutes of walking, the fall began to lighten. The only thing I really thought about while walking was how ridiculous the situation was and how unlucky I had been. But this inconvenience soon took a darker turn. As I followed the road around the curve, I noticed a large tree had fallen over the road. As I got closer, I could tell that the stump of the tree was on the side of the road that I was walking on. Approaching it, I was shocked to see how clean the cut was. It had clearly been purposefully cut down with an axe or a saw. I immediately looked around nervously into the snowy forest around me. There had to be some malicious intent behind this. I was almost sure of it. But how malicious, I didn't know. Could have just been some sick joke, forcing cars to turn around, or it could be an attempt to rob people, or even worse. I also didn't know if this was done recently or not. The road was barely used, but it surely would have been removed after a couple of days. I chose to continue walking around it, almost jogging to put distance between me and the possible trap. But I was too late. "Hey, hold up there!" A man yelled from behind me, asking me to wait. I turned, seeing what looked like 2 hunters standing right by the fallen tree. They had long rifles strapped to their shoulders and were waving their hands as if to get my attention. Being maybe 100 feet away, I stood in place thinking of what to do. One of the men yelled again, asking for help moving the tree. At this point, though, I was starting to add things up. Where were they when I was looking around? They had to have been hiding. Not to mention, I never passed a car, so why would they need help? I turned, picking up my pace and ignoring their calls. They continued shouting for a whole minute before their voices faded away through the falling snow. I eventually made it safely to my brother's house, and we went to the nearest police station to report the fallen tree and the strange hunters. An officer also came with us the following day to help retrieve my truck. Unfortunately, the windows had been shattered, and my vehicle was completely looted of everything. After having these past years to think about the ordeal, I think I have a pretty good idea of what happened. The most obvious part is that those men had likely cut the tree down on the road so that they could rob, or maybe even do worse to those who came down the isolated road. My guess is that they were probably hiding deep in the forest, listening for the sound of a car coming towards them, and that's when they would know to come out and make their move. That being said, I actually feel really lucky that I had gotten stuck on the side of the road and was forced to walk, because that had likely saved me from an even more terrifying and dangerous encounter. My parents never let me go camping as a kid. Even when I turned 18, they begged me not to go. They never told me why when I was younger, but they finally shared the story. Apparently, when my parents were still dating, they decided to go camping in the Upper Peninsula. My mom's uncle owned some cabins up there, but my dad said staying in cabins didn't count as real camping. So they brought a tent and normal camping gear. However, my mom still wanted to stay close to the cabins just in case. After a quick walk around the cabins, they went down a trail that led to a small lake. From there, they went off the trail just enough so that they couldn't hear or be bothered by anyone, but not so far that they'd get lost. My parents set up camp and swam in the lake. Overall, they had a really good day. On the way back to their tent, however, they saw a huge black mass in the trees. They stopped and watched it quietly. It was a bear, just roaming and minding its own business. It turned around to look at my parents, stared at them for a while, and then went back to walking around. My dad said it was pretty freaky to see one in real life, and this bear was huge, at least 400 pounds. My parents cautiously walked past it, still looking back to make sure it wasn't going to do anything. The bear kept glancing at them too, staring for short periods of time, which I guess isn't entirely normal, but also not too weird either. Night came, and my dad made a fire and cooked some dinner. He told me this was where things started to take a turn. Later that night, while they were talking inside their tent, they heard movement outside. They sat quietly, trying to listen to what it could be. The footsteps sounded big, not like any human. The sounds got closer and closer until they heard the metal cooking pot fall to the ground, making a loud bang, followed by the rustling of plastic. It then sounded like the animal was trying to eat the leftovers inside the cooking pot before knocking it away. Low grumbles filled the silence, and the heavy footsteps got closer to the tent. Big sniffs traveled from the bottom of the tent to the middle, where they stopped for a moment. The big animal, which my parents presumed was the bear from earlier, loudly exhaled on the tent. You could see the imprint of the bear's nose as it began sniffing again. Then it pushed its massive paw against the thin plastic, as if testing what it was. My parents stayed dead silent the entire time, having no clue what to do in this situation. The bear moved around to the front of the tent, where the zipper was, sniffing the ground at the bottom where there was a small opening. After another short moment of silence, it aggressively struck the tent with its paw, smashing the top and causing the plastic to cave in. Thankfully, it seemed to be just another test, as they heard the bear jump backwards when the tent popped back into shape. Afterwards, they could hear the massive bear walking around the campsite for a few more minutes before hurrying off into the woods. My parents stayed up for the rest of the night and left at dawn. My dad said they were lucky the bear didn't actually attack the tent, because it could have easily clawed its way in if it wasn't so nervous. Those kinds of bears don't usually attack people, so they weren't sure what it was trying to do. Either way, it was terrifying. After hearing about that encounter, I never wanted to go camping.